I pronomi diretti, indirect object pronouns. In this lesson, we will review the role of indirect objects in Italian and learn to use indirect object pronouns. First, let's look at how indirect objects work in a sentence. Indirect objects do not directly receive the action, but are secondary recipients of it. Lei scrive una lettera ad Alice. In this sentence, what is being written is the letter. The letter is the direct object and the direct recipient of the verb to write. You don't write Alice literally, you write a letter to Alice. In English, indirect objects are usually introduced by the prepositions to or for. In Italian, they are introduced by the prepositions a or per. Noi compriamo un regalo per la mamma. Similarly, in this second sentence, regalo is the direct object and mamma is the indirect object. We don't buy mamma, we buy a gift for mamma. The gift is the direct recipient of the verb to buy, while mamma is the indirect or secondary recipient, the indirect object. Now that we have reviewed the use of indirect objects, let's look at indirect object pronouns. An indirect object pronoun takes the place of an indirect object in a sentence. Indirect object pronouns are generally used to avoid restating an indirect object that has already been declared. Let's look at how it works. Lei scrive una lettera ad Alice. Lei scrive per chiedere un favore. Lei dice che è urgente. In this series of sentences, it would be possible to repeat the indirect object again in each sentence, but it would sound very repetitive and unnatural. Lei scrive una lettera ad Alice. Scrive ad Alice per chiedere un favore. Dice ad Alice che è urgente. Instead, Alice, the indirect object, is replaced by the indirect object pronoun lei. We use this same pattern in English. Instead of saying, she writes a letter to Alice, she asks Alice a favor, she tells Alice it's urgent, we say, she writes Alice a letter, she asks her a favor, she tells her it's urgent. Next, let's look at the indirect object pronouns themselves in this series of examples. Let's say that the twins Salvo and Giovanna had a birthday party. Let's look at what they received. Buon compleanno, Salvo. La mamma gli ha regalato una felpa. Lo zio gli ha comprato un giocattolino. Daniele gli ha dato un cappello. Giovanna, la zia le ha mandato una cartolina. Un amico le ha portato uno zaino. Sua cuginetta le ha comprato una bambola. Per tutte e due. I nonni gli hanno mandato soldi. Tutti i parenti gli hanno telefonato. Tutti gli amici hanno detto buon compleanno. Notice that the indirect object pronoun replacing Salvo is gli, as he is a male. The indirect object pronoun replacing Giovanna is lei, as she is a female. When the indirect object pronoun replaces Salvo and Giovanna both, gli is used. Notice that the masculine singular indirect object pronoun and the plural indirect object pronoun are identical. They are both gli. The plural form gli is invariable and is used even when referring to a group of all females. Also notice that these examples all use the passato prossimo. You can use indirect object pronouns in any tense, past or present, but our examples here take the passato prossimo. As you can see, the past participle, regalato, comprato, dato, mandato, portato, etc., never change in number and gender with indirect object pronouns as they would when used with direct object pronouns. In this table, you can see the direct object and indirect object pronouns side by side. Notice that they only differ in the third person forms. They are identical in all other forms. Me, ti, chi, vi, vi. While loro is included in this chart in the third person plural for indirect object pronouns, it should be noticed that noted that in contemporary spoken Italian, this form is usually replaced by gli. In the example of the birthday party, you saw many examples of verbs of giving that require an indirect object pronoun, like dare, regalare, comprare, mandare, portare, etc. In addition, verbs of oral and written communication, like scrivere, consigliare, ascoltare, generally take an indirect object pronoun. To conclude this presentation, let's look at some final examples of indirect object pronouns used with verbs of communication. Mia mamma mi scrive sempre, ma io non le scrivo spesso. I professori ci consigliano di studiare, ma noi non gli ascoltiamo. Lui ti ha detto la verità, ma tu non gli hai voluto ascoltare. I hope this video presentation on using indirect object pronouns in Italian has been useful. Ciao!